December 2019. In the picturesque town of Celebration, Florida, Anthony Todt, a father and physical therapist, seemed to have it all: a loving wife, 3 children, and a new life in sunny Florida. But behind the perfect facade, something unimaginable was unfolding. When federal agents arrived at the Todt home to investigate a case of healthcare fraud, they discovered far more than they ever expected. In a quiet house, hidden from the world, the bodies of Megan Todt, her 3 children, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe, lay lifeless. And their killer? Anthony Todt himself. What drove a father to take the lives of those he was meant to protect? What kind of darkness lived inside the man who would murder his own family and continue to live with their bodies for weeks? Tonight, we reveal the terrifying truth behind the Todt family massacre, a tragedy that shocked the nation. Stay with me. The town of Celebration, Florida, was everything Anthony Todt and his family could have dreamed of. Known for its idyllic streets, lush green parks, and charming homes, it was the quintessential American dream. People in the town were friendly, the schools were top-rated, and the Florida sunshine offered a sense of calm that seemed to fit perfectly with the Todt family's idealistic life. Anthony and Megan Todt, along with their 3 children, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe, had only recently relocated to Celebration from Connecticut, hoping for a fresh start. Anthony had a solid career as a physical therapist, and Megan, a stay-at-home mom, was dedicated to raising their children. On the surface, they were just like any other family in the neighborhood. They attended church together, the kids were involved in sports, and they had a house that looked like it came straight from the pages of a magazine. But beneath this picture-perfect existence, cracks were beginning to form. How did a family that seemed to have it all fall apart in such a violent, tragic way? What was hidden behind those smiles, behind the door of that seemingly perfect home? Anthony and Megan's relationship, which had always appeared loving, had started to show signs of strain long before they made the move to Florida. Their financial situation was slowly deteriorating. What many didn't know was that the Todts were struggling with significant debt, much of it stemming from Anthony's failed business ventures and mounting pressures from his physical therapy practice. Despite working hard, the business wasn't turning a profit, and Megan had become more concerned about their future. But it wasn't just financial problems that were weighing heavily on Anthony. As the months passed, he found himself deeper and deeper in a hole, both personally and professionally. His business was under investigation for healthcare fraud, and he feared that everything he had worked for was crumbling around him. To most people, the Todts appeared to have the perfect life, but what was really happening behind closed doors? Was this life of constant financial pressure and professional failure the tipping point that led to something far darker? In the weeks leading up to the horrific event, neighbors noticed a subtle shift in the Todt family's routine. Anthony, who once enjoyed spending time with his children, seemed to be preoccupied and distant. Megan, who had always been the rock of the family, began showing signs of stress. She had started reaching out for help, contacting family members about their financial troubles, yet to the outside world, the family continued to uphold their image as the perfect American family. And then there was the holiday season. Megan had planned for the family to spend Christmas together, celebrating in the warm Florida weather. But little did she know this would be the last Christmas they would ever have. The tension in the Todt household was mounting, and no one knew the extent of the darkness that was festering in Anthony's mind. He wasn't just concerned about his failing business. He was overwhelmed with fear and guilt. Fear that he would lose everything, that the consequences of his actions would destroy his family. And guilt that, despite his best efforts, he couldn't keep them afloat. But there was more to Anthony's state of mind than just financial trouble. In the quiet hours of the night, when no one was watching, Anthony started considering the unthinkable. He had been reading about family annihilators, the chilling concept of a person who, overwhelmed by stress and despair, turns to murder as a solution. Could that have been his thinking? Was this a crime of desperation, or was it something darker, more calculated? What pushed Anthony, a father who once loved his children and wife, to ultimately commit such a heinous act? The family had spent their last days together, completely unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. The children were busy with their schoolwork, the house was filled with the sounds of laughter, and Anthony seemed just like any other father trying to provide for his family. But the truth was far from that. As the weight of his financial troubles and mounting pressure from the fraud investigation suffocated him, Anthony made the decision that would alter the course of their lives forever. The story of how Anthony Todt's fear and guilt turned to a violent, irreversible decision is about to unfold, and it's more shocking than anything anyone could have predicted. What led Anthony to cross that line? What exactly happened inside that house in the days before the tragedy? And how did the Todts, a seemingly perfect family, come to an end in such a brutal, heart-wrenching way. Stay with me because the truth behind the Todt family's life and celebration will send shivers down your spine. The next chapter reveals the shocking sequence of events that led to the Todt family's tragic demise, and the eerie aftermath that followed. But how could Anthony live with what he had done? Was there a chance for the authorities to stop him before the unimaginable occurred? Anthony Todt had built the image of a man who had it all. He had a wife, Megan, who was devoted to him, 3 beautiful children, and a promising career as a physical therapist. They had recently moved to the picturesque town of Celebration, Florida, a place that seemed to offer the perfect backdrop for a fresh start. But beneath this picture-perfect life, cracks had started to form. Anthony, once a respected healthcare professional, was facing mounting pressure from all sides. His physical therapy practice, located in Connecticut, had been struggling for years. And while the Todts had hoped that a move to Florida would bring a new beginning, the reality was far different. Anthony was deeply involved in a healthcare fraud scheme that would later become a major focus of the investigation into his family's deaths. He had been accused of submitting false claims to Medicare, billing for services that were either unnecessary or never provided. As the pressure mounted, so did the toll on Anthony's mental state. He had not only to hide the criminal activities from his wife, Megan, but also to keep up the appearance of a man in control. In one of his final moments of normalcy, Anthony took his family on trips, posted photos on social media, and participated in community events, giving everyone the illusion of a happy life. But in the background, his fraudulent activities were unraveling. He had been under investigation by the federal authorities, and the threat of a looming indictment hung over him like a dark cloud. What started as financial stress gradually morphed into an overwhelming fear of losing everything. The fraud scheme that Anthony had carefully cultivated over the years was now collapsing, and his life, once filled with hope, was spiraling toward ruin. What could have driven Anthony to commit such an unspeakable act against his own family? Was it the stress of a growing criminal investigation, or the overwhelming pressure of facing possible jail time? The more we learned about Anthony's hidden world, the more the truth became terrifying. He had been caught between the desire to protect his family from financial ruin and the fear of losing his freedom. In a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of his actions, could Anthony have seen no way out but violence? But what about Megan, his wife, who was completely unaware of his growing troubles? She was working hard to support the family, frequently posting about her business successes and her seemingly happy home life. Was she truly in the dark, or had she suspected something? Had she confronted Anthony in the days leading up to the murders? Megan's trust in her husband was unwavering, and yet, as the truth about Anthony's fraud began to surface, so did the fear. Anthony had been hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And that dark secret would soon come to light with deadly consequences. You might be asking, how could a father, a husband, betray the very people he promised to protect? What would it take for a man to destroy his own family, his wife, his children, and even their dog? What did Anthony Todt do to keep up the facade of a perfect family life when his world was crashing down around him? The answers lie in the chilling final days before the murders, when the weight of his lies, crimes, and fear for his future became too much to bear. And the truth? It's far more horrifying than anyone could have anticipated. Before we continue, let me ask you, how far would you go to escape the consequences of your actions? Would you choose to protect the ones you love, or would the overwhelming pressure push you over the edge? If you're intrigued and want to know what happened in those final days before the horrific murders, hit that like button and subscribe for more details. We'll uncover exactly how Anthony Todt's lies unraveled, leading to the devastating tragedy that shocked the world. But it doesn't stop here. Stay with me as we uncover the heart-stopping events leading to that fateful day. It was December 2019, and Megan had just returned from a trip. Anthony had planned for her to come back to a holiday season, but instead, she would return to a horror so terrifying it would shake the foundations of their home forever. On December 19th, Megan Todt would unknowingly step into her last moments with her family. Anthony, facing the collapse of everything he had built, was already planning something devastating, something irreversible. But what pushed him to commit such an unthinkable act? What led a father to turn against his own flesh and blood? It was late at night when the horrors began to unfold. Anthony, in the midst of mounting stress, seems to have snapped. On that fateful night, he would end the lives of his wife Megan and their 3 children. What's chilling about this case is that Anthony didn't just murder them. He executed them while they slept. His wife, Megan, was the first to fall victim. She was strangled just like his children. But this wasn't just an act of impulsive rage. It was premeditated. It was calculated. Anthony knew exactly what he was doing, and he carried out the killings with methodical precision. But it wasn't over. Once his wife and children were dead, Anthony didn't call the police or alert anyone. Instead, he stayed in the house. The very home where the murders took place became a chilling tomb. He continued his daily routine, even pretending everything was normal, living with their bodies for days. In fact, he lived with them for weeks. He cooked meals. He fed his dog. And for the outside world, everything seemed perfectly fine. He would even go so far as to text and communicate with friends and family, leaving no sign that his life had been shattered by a horrific crime. Was it denial? Or was it an eerie attempt to maintain control over a spiraling situation? And the horror doesn't end there. What's even more disturbing is how Anthony went about hiding the bodies. He didn't dispose of them in some random spot. No, he was meticulous. He placed their bodies in different locations, staging the scene in an attempt to avoid suspicion. The bodies were moved into different rooms, strategically placed to appear as if they had been victims of a more complex and grisly crime. But why the delay? Why not call it in immediately? Why not get help? For weeks, Anthony lived a lie, walking past the lifeless bodies of his wife and children. Every morning, he would go on with his life as if nothing had happened. As though his own family hadn't been slaughtered in cold blood. Then the silence became too much to bear. After his actions began to weigh heavily on his conscience, perhaps something inside him snapped. On January 13, 2020, after weeks of hiding the crime, Anthony was finally confronted by federal agents. Agents who had come to his home for an unrelated investigation into the fraud case that had been consuming his life. But what they would find in that house would shock them to the core. The agents were not just investigating a financial fraud, they were about to stumble upon a crime scene like no other. When the agents walked into the Todt household, they were met with a sickening sight. The smell, the disarray, everything seemed off. The house was eerily quiet. As they searched the home, they found the bodies of Megan and the children, each one brutally murdered, cold and still. But what sent chills down their spines wasn't just the gruesome discovery, it was the revelation that Anthony Todt had been living with the corpses for weeks. He'd gone about his life, pretending everything was normal while his family lay dead in the house. Why would he do such a thing? Was it the pressure from his financial woes? Or was there something darker brewing beneath the surface of his life? The truth was slowly beginning to surface, but the full picture of Anthony Todt's chilling actions wouldn't come to light for some time. And as the authorities pieced together his story, they uncovered even more about the psychological state of a man who could commit such an atrocity, yet continue his life as though it were business as usual. What made Anthony Todt think he could get away with this? And why did he think no one would suspect him? His confession would finally explain the unfathomable act. But what details could Anthony possibly reveal that would shed light on what drove him to take the lives of his family? What twisted reasoning did he have? The true horror was just beginning. What would Anthony Todt reveal in his confession? And how far was he willing to go to avoid being caught? Stay tuned, because the twists in this case are only just beginning. The moment federal agents stepped into the Todt family's home in December 2019, the gravity of the situation hit hard. But it wasn't the kind of discovery they expected. They were there to follow up on a healthcare fraud investigation that had been building for months. What they found was far more disturbing. As authorities walked through the Todt's home, something felt wrong. The air was still, almost unnervingly so. It didn't take long for the first signs of the gruesome truth to emerge. The bodies of Megan Todt, her 3 children, Alec, Tyler, and Zoe, were found in various rooms of the house. Their lifeless bodies were badly decomposed. And in the midst of all this horror, there was no immediate panic from Anthony Todt, no frantic attempts to explain, just a chilling calmness that sent a ripple of unease through the investigators. How had he kept up the charade for so long? And why hadn't anyone suspected anything sooner? The discovery was horrifying, but what would follow was just as disturbing. As investigators continued to search the house, they realized the extent of Anthony's deception. He had been living in the house with his family's bodies for over 2 weeks, still trying to maintain a sense of normalcy as if nothing was wrong. And even worse, when they questioned him, Todt's responses were disturbingly calm. The question on everyone's mind was simple: how could a man who seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, commit such a horrific act? But as detectives soon learned, Anthony Todt had been hiding more than just his crime. His life was crumbling under the weight of mounting financial troubles. On the surface, his physical therapy clinic in Connecticut appeared to be a success, but behind the scenes he was under investigation for fraudulent billing practices. Federal agents were already circling his clinic, but the crime at home wasn't about money, it was something darker. Was it the fear of losing everything? Or did the pressures of his crumbling family life finally push him to the edge? Investigators weren't sure, but there was one thing they knew for certain. Anthony Todt was the man who had killed his wife and children, and somehow he was still playing the role of the loving father. As the case began to unfold, the FBI took over and the story only got more twisted. Investigators learned that Anthony had told a series of lies to cover up his actions. At first, he claimed to have left the house for a few days on a trip to visit family, only to return and find that his wife and children had mysteriously disappeared. The authorities weren't buying it. His story didn't add up. But why had he gone to such lengths to cover up the truth? Was he afraid of the consequences of his actions? Or was there something deeper at play? Weeks went by before the breakthrough. During a series of interrogations, the truth slowly began to surface. When confronted with evidence, Anthony's demeanor shifted. He was no longer the calm, composed man he had been in the initial stages of the investigation. It was as though the weight of his own lies had finally begun to crush him. In one of the most chilling moments of the case, Anthony finally confessed. In a room with law enforcement officials, he admitted to killing his wife and 3 children. He described how, in a fit of rage, he had taken their lives. But his explanation only raised more questions. Why had he waited so long to turn himself in? Why had he chosen to live with the bodies for weeks, pretending everything was normal? What kind of man was capable of such monstrous actions? And what was his real motive? Anthony's confession was just the beginning. As more details came to light, investigators began piecing together a picture of a man who, on the surface, appeared to be a loving husband and father. But beneath that facade was a man filled with resentment, fear, and a deep-seated desperation. It was clear that the murders weren't just the result of a single moment of rage. They were the culmination of years of financial pressure, a deteriorating marriage, and a growing sense of failure. Anthony's world had been unraveling, and in his mind, the only way out was to destroy everything that had once held him together. But the story wasn't over. There was still more to uncover about the twisted mindset of Anthony Todt. The investigation was just beginning, and authorities knew there were more dark secrets to be revealed. What would happen when the full details of his confession came to light? Could his actions be explained by his overwhelming financial strain, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? In the coming moments, we will uncover the chilling psychological factors that might explain Anthony Todt's actions, and the chilling details that no one saw coming. Don't go anywhere because what happens next will send shivers down your spine. The horror of the Todt family murders shocked not only the residents of Celebration, Florida, but the entire nation. With the discovery of the bodies and Anthony Todt's eventual confession, the case seemed clear-cut, yet the path to his trial was anything but simple. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to that fateful December night, they uncovered a series of chilling details about Anthony's behavior after the murders. The weeks spent living in the house with his wife and children's bodies, maintaining the illusion of a normal family life, left many wondering, how could he carry on as if nothing had happened? What kind of man could pretend to be grieving while hiding such a dark secret? On January 13, 2020, Anthony Todt was formally arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty. His arrest came after an extensive investigation, but even more unsettling was the revelation that Todt had confessed to the crime during questioning. He had claimed that the killings were the result of a moment of desperation, fueled by his mounting financial troubles, his fear of losing his family, and the federal fraud investigation that was closing in on him. But was that the full truth? According to Todt's confession, the killings were not spur of the moment. He explained that his financial situation had deteriorated, and he feared the consequences of the investigation into his fraudulent billing practices. His wife, Megan, had reportedly found out about the fraud and had confronted him. The pressure, combined with the strain in their marriage, drove Todt to take a fatal, irreversible step. Yet, there was something more unsettling in his words. Something that suggested the crime wasn't just about the financial mess or the fear of legal consequences. Why did he kill his children? Why did he murder his wife, who had 3 children of her own? Could it have been a crime born from deep resentment, or was this act driven by a twisted sense of control? Was there a deeper darkness within Todt that went beyond his financial despair? As his confession came to light, his defense attorney tried to shift the focus from cold-blooded murder to mental health issues, suggesting that Anthony Todt had been suffering from an untreated psychological condition that led to the killings. Experts and family members weighed in on whether Todt had displayed any signs of mental illness in the past, None came forward to suggest that he had been diagnosed or had shown signs of violence before the murders. Still, the defense clung to the idea that his mental state had deteriorated under the immense pressure of the fraud investigation. Could that have been enough to push him over the edge? The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that the murders were premeditated, fueled by financial pressure, and executed with a chilling calmness. Anthony Todt had planned everything. He had already set up an elaborate lie to cover up the murders, and when authorities arrived at the home, Todt was still pretending that his family was alive, as if nothing had happened. The trial began in early 2021, and from the start, it was clear that the public's attention was riveted by the crime's shocking nature. Todt's actions, living in the house with his family's bodies, taking trips to the grocery store, and even posting on social media as if nothing had changed, sparked intense debates about the depths of his depravity. In court, Todt faced multiple counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution laid out a compelling case, that Todt had meticulously planned the murders, killed his wife and children, then lived among the corpses, pretending everything was fine. They presented evidence of his financial difficulties, the fraud investigation, and his attempts to keep up the facade of a normal life. What shocked many was the discovery that he had even continued to work as a physical therapist while the bodies of his family decomposed in the home. His apparent ability to compartmentalize his horrific crime from his daily life left many wondering how such a brutal act could coexist with such a seemingly normal existence. The defense, however, suggested that Anthony Todt was struggling with more than just financial hardship. He was facing the mental toll of his lies catching up with him. They argued that his state of mind at the time of the murders could be considered in mitigation, making the crime not entirely cold-blooded. But the evidence, his confession, the planning, and the fact that he lived with the bodies for weeks, pointed in another direction. There was no real argument to suggest that Todt was incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. As the trial continued, testimonies from family members and investigators further painted a picture of a man who had carefully orchestrated his family's demise. The state presented a video recording of Todt's interrogation, where he coldly recounted the moment he killed his wife, Megan, and then turned on his children. He claimed that after killing Megan, he smothered the children in their beds, one by one. They were just so innocent. "How could I do this to them?" he said in the recording, his voice betraying no real emotion. By the time the trial reached its conclusion, the case against Anthony Todt seemed undeniable. The prosecution painted him as a man who had lost everything and chose the most horrific way to deal with his downfall. For many, Todt's actions were not just about financial pressure, they were about control, power, and ultimately a desperate desire to escape the consequences of his actions. On February 26, 2021, after a grueling trial, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. Anthony Todt was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of animal cruelty for the death of the family dog. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was handed down, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of the crime settling over everyone present. The Todt family, who had once been seen as a normal, happy family, were now victims of a horrifying act that no one could have predicted. But questions still lingered. Could the psychological pressures and financial strain really have led Anthony Todt to commit such an unspeakable act? Was this simply a case of a man snapping under stress, or was there something more deeply sinister at play? The trial didn't answer all the questions, but it did one thing. It confirmed that the tragedy in Celebration was a premeditated act, one that will forever haunt those who knew the Todt family. Anthony Todt's conviction brought some measure of closure, but for the surviving family members and for those who knew Megan and her children, the devastation remains. And as Anthony Todt sits in prison for the rest of his life, the mystery of his true motives may never be fully solved. Was it just about the financial collapse, or was there something far darker that motivated a man to destroy the people he loved most? Only Anthony Todt knows for sure. But his chilling confession, his actions, and his trial have left us with more questions than answers. And for the Todt family's survivors, those who still seek answers, the search for understanding is far from over. When Anthony Todt was arrested for the brutal murders of his wife, Megan, and their 3 children, the questions that followed were not only about the act itself but about why. What could drive a man to not only kill his entire family but to live with their bodies for weeks after the crime? To truly understand the motivations behind the Todt family massacre, we must delve deep into the psychology of Anthony Todt. The weight of financial strain. Anthony Todt had always seemed to present himself as a loving father and dedicated husband. He moved his family to Celebration, Florida, ostensibly to start a fresh life. But beneath the surface, there were mounting pressures that would later seem too great for him to bear. Financial instability had long been a part of the Todt family's life. Anthony was under investigation for federal healthcare fraud, accused of falsifying documents and making false claims through his physical therapy clinic. The legal and financial troubles were severe. These problems had begun to pile up, putting significant strain on his personal life. However, this isn't just a story about financial ruin. It's about what that ruin did to Anthony's mental state. Experts have long argued that when individuals face insurmountable financial pressure, especially when it involves criminal investigations, the resulting stress can trigger a sense of total loss. The prospect of being caught, of losing everything, can be so overwhelming that, for some, it becomes easier to take extreme action. In Todt's case, the fear of financial devastation could have been the catalyst for something far more chilling. But was financial pressure truly enough to justify such a heinous act? Or was there more to Anthony's psychology than simply money? The psychological concept of family annihilators. Experts classify Anthony Todt as what is often called a family annihilator, a person who kills their close family members, often with premeditation, and then either takes their own life or surrenders to law enforcement. In Todt's case, the fact that he lived in the house with his family's decomposing bodies for weeks after the murders suggests a chilling indifference to the lives of his loved ones. What makes family annihilators so terrifying is their ability to compartmentalize their feelings of love and attachment. Typically, family annihilators do not feel the normal emotional bonds that a person might expect when it comes to loved ones. There's a chilling disconnect between the killer's actions and the outward appearance of their life. This is especially true in the Todt case, where Anthony continued to go about his daily routine, running errands, taking the kids to school, while his family lay dead inside the home. In many family annihilator cases, there is often a perceived sense of betrayal or loss of control, which might drive the killer to make a violent attempt at regaining control over their circumstances. In Todt's case, it seems as though his world was crumbling. The loss of his business, his reputation, and his family's future may have pushed him to an irreversible state of desperation. The role of isolation. Another significant factor in understanding Anthony Todt's psychological state is the isolation his family experienced. The Todts moved from Connecticut to Florida, away from family and familiar support systems. Though they had made a home in the picturesque community of Celebration, Florida, it was clear that Anthony was under immense stress, both from the investigation into his fraudulent actions and from the strain of trying to maintain an image of a perfect family. This isolation, both physical and emotional, was likely a contributing factor to Todt's increasingly fragile mental state. People in isolated environments, especially those under significant stress, are more likely to experience heightened feelings of alienation and despair. Without an emotional support system to turn to, Todt may have felt trapped, with nowhere to go but inward, toward darker thoughts and violent action. But was it only the isolation that drove him to murder? Could there have been other, deeper psychological factors at play? The influence of narcissism and control. Psychologists have suggested that narcissism may have played a role in Todt's behavior. Narcissism is a personality trait characterized by a sense of entitlement, grandiosity, and a lack of empathy for others. This characteristic often results in individuals who seek to maintain control over their lives and those around them, sometimes to an extreme degree. For Todt, the combination of narcissism and mounting external pressure could have contributed to his violent outburst. His need to maintain control over his family's future and his own reputation may have led him to conclude that killing his wife and children was the only way to regain power and control in his life. If the facade of the perfect family was shattered, he may have viewed their deaths as a way to preserve the image he was so desperate to uphold, even at the cost of their lives. Could Anthony Todt have seen this as his only option? A way to fix his life, despite its unraveling? The lasting impact of a failed mental state. When looking at Todt's behavior post-crime, living in the home with the bodies for weeks, it's clear that his mental state had deteriorated to a frightening degree. His ability to function in a normal way while knowing that his family was dead suggests a form of dissociation. This psychological condition occurs when a person mentally disconnects from reality, often as a way to cope with traumatic or overwhelming circumstances. Anthony's apparent ability to go on with his day-to-day life after committing such a gruesome act is indicative of a man who had completely shut down emotionally. He no longer viewed his family members as individuals with their own lives and futures, but rather as objects in his life, dispensable and replaceable. Psychologists often note that when people are faced with immense personal failures or challenges, especially financial ruin and the prospect of criminal exposure, they may go into survival mode, where they perceive themselves as the only victim and everything around them as obstacles that need to be eliminated. Was Anthony Todt's belief that his family was standing in the way of his survival a driving force behind the killings? Was he able to justify these acts in his mind by seeing himself as the only one who mattered, the only one who needed to be preserved? The unanswered question. Understanding the psychological motives behind Anthony Todt's brutal actions requires considering both his external pressures and his internal psychological makeup. The overwhelming financial pressure, the sense of isolation, and the apparent narcissism and control issues created the perfect storm for this tragedy. Yet, one question remains unanswered. Was this a premeditated act of desperation, or did something even darker influence Todt's decision to annihilate his own family? Tonight, we may never fully understand what drove him to such depths of horror, but what we do know is that the Todt family massacre is a devastating reminder of how fragile the human psyche can be when confronted with immense pressure, and how a life, once seemingly perfect, can unravel into something far beyond comprehension. After the horrific discovery of the Todt family's bodies in January 2020, the small community of Celebration, Florida, was left in shock. What had once been a town known for its picturesque streets and family-friendly atmosphere was now a place marked by unimaginable tragedy. The Todts had been living in the neighborhood for just a short time, and to many, they seemed like a typical family. No one could understand how something so unspeakable could happen just blocks away. In the days following the discovery, news outlets across the country scrambled to report on the details, and what had initially appeared to be a case of healthcare fraud quickly turned into one of the most chilling family murders the state had ever seen. Anthony Todt's arrest rocked the community, with neighbors and friends struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the horrific actions he had taken. Local residents, many of whom had never suspected that anything was wrong, began asking themselves, how could someone who appeared so normal, who even seemed like an involved father and husband, commit such a horrific crime? As news spread, a larger question lingered. What could have driven a father who was under financial strain to murder his entire family? Was it the mounting pressure from the healthcare fraud investigation? Or something deeper? The idea that a man could not only kill his wife and children but live in the house with their bodies for weeks left everyone reeling. The case was the talk of the town and beyond. But the true horror was the thought that Anthony Todt's behavior had been so calculated, so cold, that he was able to continue living in that home for several weeks, even with the lifeless bodies of his family around him. For weeks, the residents of Celebration were gripped by fear, confusion, and a sense of betrayal. Local authorities worked quickly to assure the public that the community was safe, but the psychological impact of such a brutal crime lingered in the air. In addition to the grief felt by those who knew the Todt family, there was a deeper ripple effect. People began to question how well they really knew their neighbors. Could something like this happen in their own quiet neighborhood? What did it say about the pressures hidden behind closed doors and seemingly perfect families? As the investigation continued, Anthony Todt's trial would go on to capture national attention. It became clear that the Todts were not the only victims in this case. The community of Celebration had been shattered by the truth, and it would take years for the scars to heal. But even then, questions remained. Would anyone have suspected the darkness that had been quietly festering in Anthony Todt? And what could have been done to prevent this tragedy from unfolding? The Todt family murders left behind a powerful legacy of unanswered questions and an unsettling reminder that even the most perfect facades can conceal unthinkable horrors. This story may be over, but the questions and the chilling images it leaves behind remain. Thank you for watching. If you were disturbed by this story or find yourself questioning the depths of human behavior, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think Anthony Todt's actions could have been prevented? Was there any way to stop this tragedy before it happened? Leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime documentaries. Your support helps bring awareness to these horrific cases and ensures that their victims are never forgotten. Stay with us for more real-life stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature.